There we go.
Here we go. Good
Here
heavens.
we go.
I've been trying to get in for 20 minutes now.
Oh, no.
So anyway, trying not to take it personally that it wouldn't let the presenter in, but I'm going to go ahead and screen share and let's see if I can get this back to the beginning. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So here we are for part 2. For those of you who were not with us last week, I hope you've had a chance to look at the recording, and even if you haven't, we'll muddle our way through here.
I'm trying to get through out here. The TV.
What's that?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I'm not on mute. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. So tonight we're going to look particularly at the history of the Mayflower. And in doing that, we're going to talk about what it meant then, or what it means for us now and into the future. So the whole question about this is, as we approach our 100th anniversary and we move to our next 100 years, what do we want to be remembered for? And just to remind everybody, or if you weren't with us last week, to let you know, we're not making any decisions here about the name of the church. This is simply opening a conversation. Our healthy guidelines do apply to our discussions. And if you don't know what those are or whatever, drop me a note in chat, or better yet, drop Christian a note in chat and I'll let him take care of that with you. And so again, I'm going to be doing about a half an hour, which is going to be truncated because we're so late getting started, of information. And then we're going to break into small groups for about a half an hour. And then we'll come back together for about a half an hour as a large group. So that's where we're heading. So I think most of us are familiar with the myth. And the myth, like all myths, has got a mix of some truth in it. The myth is this group of pilgrims left Plymouth, England on a ship bound for the New World seeking religious freedom. That is true. These God-fearing people.
Anita,
what?
this is Gary. Do you have the slide up that you think you have up? Small group discussion.
I'm sorry, what?
I see a slide that says small group discussion.
Yeah, I think you're at the wrong slide.
I'm looking at a few notes and Mayflower the myth, but you're not getting that?
No,
We're on slide 13.
Okay, let's try this again, because
There.
Lord knows
That's
There it is.
there you go.
we don't want anything simple here. So we'll try this again.
It's good.
Can you see Mayflower the myth?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you for stopping me. Okay, so anyway, a group of pilgrims left Plymouth. They were seeking religious freedom. These were God-fearing people, that was true. And they were seen as our forebearers in establishing the first colony in the New World, which is actually not true. The first colony was in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. So as a native Virginian, I always feel compelled to remind people that it didn't start in 1620. And as the myth goes, they landed on Plymouth Rock. This is the rock. That's the temple that they built to house the rock. That is a myth. They did not land on a rock in Plymouth, but nevertheless, it makes a lot of money for Plymouth tourist business.
We're not on the rock.
What's that?
Said we're not on slide 6. Well, whichever one shows the rock.
This is the rock.
Yeah, no.
It's slide 5.
Yeah, but that's not what we're seeing.
We're not seeing slide 5.
Okay, let's try this again.
There you
Now
go.
we see the rock.
There's the rock.
And the temple.
And the temple. So if I go to that, you still see the rock?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And
Now
the
we see the
temple.
rock in the temple.
Mhm.
Okay.
But I think if you would click slideshow, because we're seeing the whole big deal. We're not seeing,
There we
there you
go.
go.
Much
Okay,
better.
now you're there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's the
Yeah.
rock, there's the temple. That they built over it. It's, I've been there several times. It's a pretty interesting place, but it didn't really get there until the bicentennial of the landing. So 1820 is where we start all of this mythological stuff, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The myth part always says that our relationship with the Native Americans, the Indians, was cordial, and that the natives were welcoming and only too happy to convert to Christianity. That was sort of true for about 2 years. Not entirely true, but sort of true. And so I'm being a bit tongue in cheek, but these are the stories that people think are the history of all of this. So you see the friendly, relationship with the pilgrims. If we get to the reality is that we have this cast of characters. We have separatists, we have semi-separatists, we have pilgrims, we have Puritans, and we have the saints. We don't hear that. We just hear pilgrims every year. The separatists were those who had left the Church of England because they didn't think there was anything that could be done with it. And a group of them went to Holland. Then there's a group of semi-separatists, and that's where our story starts. They didn't really want to leave the Church of England, but they weren't getting what they wanted. They were following John Robinson, who had been an Anglican minister and had been kicked out. And they were in Leiden, Holland. They were not as the earlier group was, they were not as anti-Church of England. And he was the leader of the congregation, and that congregation decided that they ought to send some of its members, not all of them, but 41 of them, to the New World. And in his farewell sermon, one of the lines that Robinson uses is, "More light and truth is to break forth from God's holy word." And if that sounds familiar, I hope it does anyway. The God is Still Speaking campaign used that quite a bit. But because they didn't want to go as Dutch settlers to the New World, they wanted to go as Englishmen. They sought a charter from the Virginia Company, which was settling colonies. They had settled 1607 in Jamestown, and the Crown, so that they could go to the New World. And there were two ships actually that left Plymouth, England, but one of them, the Speedwell, began to take on a lot of water. And so they had to return to Plymouth, put everybody into one cargo ship, the Mayflower, which had only usually carried things like wine and dry goods, not human beings. And incidentally, there is this rumor out there that it was a slave ship. It was not a slave ship, never was. It was later, after its sailing days were over with, scuttled for wood back in England. So it never had slavery as its heart. So you have this crew of semi-separatists who call themselves the Saints. They didn't call themselves pilgrims. That happened in 1820 at its bicentennial. So you got the crew, the Saints, and what the Saints called the strangers. And they were craftsmen and indentured servants who they were taking along to actually do the labor of building when they got to the New World. But this put these people in very crowded and very unhealthy conditions. So you can see this drawing here of people crowded into this deck. The cargo actually has more room than the people do. It was very unhealthy and left people very anxious and angry with each other in some ways. So they were supposed to go to the area known around New York City on the Hudson. But after 65 days crossing, the ship landed in what we now call Provincetown, Massachusetts. They spent 5 weeks in the harbor at Provincetown, and then they moved on to what we now know as Plymouth. And of course, since they had come from Plymouth, they named it New Plymouth. And they lived on the ship there outside of Plymouth for 5 months while housing was built. Now, William Bradford, who was like the first governor, said that the Mayflower ended up where it was, not where it was supposed to be, because of storms. But there are some other accounts that say that the Virginia colony had actually decided they weren't sure they wanted these people, so they paid the captain to take the group north. It's hard to tell whether there's truth in that or whether the storm thing is true, but nevertheless, they didn't end up where they were supposed to be. This is the Provincetown Harbor, and you can't really see it very well because it's blurry, but this is the Pilgrim Monument, which is this high point in Provincetown that marks the Pilgrim landing. It was the Saints landing there. So when they got to where they were in Provincetown, or in Massachusetts, what would become Massachusetts, the strangers who were with them argued that the contract that they had with them was null and void because, it was null and void with the Virginia company because they weren't where they were supposed to be. So male passengers, 41 total male passengers, not just Saints, a few strangers joined them because the women weren't allowed to sign, signed what they call the Mayflower Compact. And that became the basis for the government of the new colony. It influenced Congregationalism in the years to come. And it also later influenced the role of the new government in the country. It's part of that history. Now, if you think about the relationship with the Native Americans, the indigenous people, the Indians, as they're usually called, the colonists, when they came there, met a man, we usually know him as Squanto, but his real name was Tisquantum, or Tisquantum. I can't talk tonight. Tisquantum. He had been captured by Captain John Smith and was supposed to be sold into slavery, but he escaped somehow to England. There he learned English, and when he returned to the New World, he tried to go back to his people, which were the Pawtucket tribe, which was mainly in Rhode Island, but southern Massachusetts, and they had been wiped out by a plague. And we'll talk in a minute about plagues and what happened to indigenous people with the new colonists. So he went north and joined up with the Wampanoag Indians, and that was in the area where the Mayflower settlers were. Tisquantum, as I said, spoke English, and he became an interpreter and a mediator with the various Wampanoag tribes, and there were several. But the one that's been most important in our history here is the Pokanoket, and their chief was Massasoit. And Tisquantum helped the colonists and Massasoit negotiate an agreement. He then later taught the colonists, how to plant corn, fish, hunt. And then he decided that he wanted to get power, and he tried to turn the colonists against Chief Massasoit. And in trying to do that, he stirred up a lot of anger that was actually there. There were other members of the tribe and of the other Wampanoag tribes that weren't thrilled with having these colonists there. Tisquantum died in 1622, and shortly after he died, the relationship just deteriorated very quickly. So, like I said, they were initially welcoming and hospitable, but it wouldn't last very long. And so his Massasoit's son, Wamsutta, chose to completely abandon the agreement that his father had negotiated with the colonists, and all bets were off. Now, the Pokanoket that are the people that the meal that we've often credited as the first Thanksgiving was shared with. Again, it was mostly the men, but that wasn't because the women weren't allowed. It was because most of the women had died by the time this famous meal happened. But the settlers themselves, the colonists, had a practice of days of fasting at the end of the harvest in order to give thanks. And so this practice slowly over time became more widely accepted. Lincoln proclaims the first Thanksgiving when Abraham Lincoln is president. So this is not, it's not a custom that begins with this meal. The first Thanksgiving, that meal becomes a myth created to promote tourism in Plymouth, along with the Rock, and renaming the colonists the Pilgrims. So that's sort of all of that.
Anita, I don't get the days of fasting. Maybe more days of feasting, more like it.
Well, they would fast and then they would feast.
All right.
But it started with fasting and worship, of course, to give thanks. That was what the original thing had been, and then they would move into, after they had fasted, given thanks, they would move into a meal to celebrate that. So that helped. The settlers were very much following Manifest Destiny. I doubt that they understood what Manifest Destiny was, because of course these are good, good Protestants, be they out of the Church of England or not. And that was something that the popes had put in place to help conquer the New World. Settlers were supposed to go and they were supposed to bring Christianity, and if they won't convert, then they die. And that's a very simplistic way of understanding Manifest Destiny, but it's that same mindset that they're operating with. In fact, very quickly, most of the indigenous population was devastated by an old world bacteria. And I'm not even going to try to say that word, but you can see it. The Crown called it a wonderful plague because so many of the indigenous folks died.
Leptospirosis.
How do you pronounce it?
Leptospirosis.
Thank you. Leptospirosis. I just knew my tongue wasn't going to cooperate tonight. One historian has called this time period after 1622, when the relationship deteriorates between the indigenous peoples and the colonists. He's called it the barbarous years because they become violent and bloody, and there's torture. The real move is to try to erase or subdue the indigenous inhabitants of the New World. Many were shipped to the Caribbean and sold as slaves to make money for the colony. Later on, we'll get the Pequot Wars, which were between the indigenous and the colonists. The indigenous didn't fare so well. Later, even later than that, is King Philip's War. Again, the indigenous did not fare well against the colonists, but it's the kind of thing that is hard sometimes for us to think about, because, let me stop the share. You don't need to see all my emails. It's hard for us sometimes to think about these things because we don't want to perhaps own up to what our ancestors did. And it's a very difficult situation to reckon with. Are there questions at this point? Because I just flew through that history, and there's so much that I was just trying to give you highlights. There is a ton of history out there about all of this, but
Anita, I have a
Yeah.
couple of questions that are sort of related. Is Manifest Destiny the same as the Doctrine of Discovery, similar, different, and sort of related to that? To what extent was the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, to what extent did that become a template for what informed the Europeans when they arrived?
yeah, Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny are very related terms.
Okay.
Doctrine of Discovery is maybe the more common term we've used here, but at Mayflower. As to the conquest, I would imagine there were some biblical, because these folks found grounding in scripture for everything.
Mhm.
But I've not read anything specifically about that. If somebody else has, that would be great, but Belle?
There's two books that you all might enjoy reading if you haven't read them already. One is a book by a man named Nathaniel Philbrick called The Mayflower, which goes into how these people found the Mayflower and the Speedwell and all the nasty stuff the captains and the shareholders of those boats were doing. They were all just taken in by these nasty people and given these terribly leaky boats, and an irresponsible captain that thought he could sail across the North Atlantic in the late fall, which in North Atlantic is notoriously known for huge headwinds. So no wonder it took them 65 days to get over there. So it gives you some background of how the Pilgrims regarded the Indians, but it doesn't go into the bloody stuff that another book called Brethren by Nature by a woman named Margaret Ellen Newell. It reads like a PhD thesis with lots and lots of primary sources and footnotes and all, but it documents exactly what Anita's talking about, how these people took advantage of the Indians. They even enslaved Squantos children and sent them off to the Caribbean, which was the beginning of the basic economy of the New World that was fueled by slavery, that is so well documented in Jill Lepore's book about how our country was established. So those three books, and I'll look in my bookshelf to tell you what Jill Lepore's title is, I've found just very illuminating, especially me, whose ancestor, I am a descendant of John All and Priscilla Mullins, and I had to reassess my feeling about my ancestry.
Yeah, I will say, because we briefly talked about the Philbrick book last week, there are some UCC historians that have quibbles with the book, but yeah, basically it's a good account. The other book that I would recommend, and the one that I'm using a lot, is This Land is Our Land. And it's the story, and I'll find the author later, but it's the story of the Wampanoag and the Mayflower descendants. So yes, Jeff, I see Jeff, and then Chris.
Yeah.
Yes,
Just
Christian. Go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
Just a point of clarification, Manifest Destiny is a phrase coined in 1845 by an American historian talking about the United States' inevitable conquest of the Western lands. The Doctrine of Discovery is the original papal notion.
Papal thing. Yep, you're right. Thank you.
Same spirit, different
Same
phrase.
spirit. Yep. Anything
Well,
else?
I'm confused. So are you saying that the first congregation or the congregationals originated from the Pilgrims? Is that accurate?
Yes, the early Congregationalists came out of these settlers that came to what we now know as
Right,
Massachusetts.
okay.
But there were Congregationalists in England, there were Congregationalists in Holland. You know, so, and Siri's trying to tell me it found something.
Talking to Siri.
Thank you, Siri. Christian, you wanted to say something a second ago?
Yeah, I had a question over here. I'm over here hanging out with some of the young adults from the church.
Oh, okay.
We're having a little
It's
watch
very
party.
dark, so we can't see.
Anything. But anyway, my particular question was is in regards to like this history that you're talking about right now is like particularly about the Mayflower, like the Congregationalists, all of this. I'm really curious as to if you're going to go into why the people who started our church in 1925, they chose to call themselves Mayflower Church. Is that a part of this class at all?
That wasn't what I was going to talk about. No, I was trying
Okay,
to do
cool.
more of the other history, and there may be somebody here who has a better grasp of that history than I do. I've never read that I know of why Mayflower was chosen. I can just tell you that most of the early, or not early, but the congregational churches tended to name themselves Plymouth. They tended to name themselves Mayflower. They tended, or they were the first church, second church, third church. We lived in Guilford, Connecticut, and there at one point were at least 3, maybe 4 congregational churches on the green. They could all look at each other on Sunday morning, and very frustrating to sort of sort it all out. Only First Congregational still survives. The others managed to merge into it at some point. One of the churches is now a Seventh-day Adventist church and that kind of thing. So, but yeah, that why we chose Mayflower, I don't know that, but I'm happy to turn that over to somebody else if they know.
Probably associated with the Plymouth congregation.
Yeah,
from-
we were a
from South Plymouth.
colony church of Plymouth Church.
Church,
Right,
that makes
We were a
sense.
mission church, you
Right.
know.
right. And they were
Yep.
Plymouth, so we should be Mayflower.
Yep,
Right.
makes sense.
Got
We
it.
couldn't be Plymouth.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I am going to put you all in small groups, and I am putting in the chat the questions for discussion. So you should be able to access it. Let's see, there's 21 people. So let's try to do 5. We'll do 5 breakout rooms, and that's 4 people per room. Or if you're 2 of you in the frame, you're considered one person in this situation. So, and Christian, I'm going to have you, the group at the church. I assume that you're at the church. Anyway, the group you're with will be one group. All right. So here we go. We're going to take about a half an hour, and then we'll come back and have conversation. Julie, can you figure out?
Well,
You should have gotten it. There you go. All right. So we're still waiting for folks to come, but
Yeah. No, y'all good.
Zoom will kick everybody out. So
Yep.
one of the fun things about Zoom. Anyway, so how did your conversations go? Anybody?
We had a good conversation in our group. Spent a little time getting to know each other because we didn't know each other that well, but had a chance to talk about some of the symbols and got right to the name change and how we feel about all of that. So it was time well spent.
Good. Anybody want to say more about that conversation, or did others have similar conversations?
Well, we talked about the things. The Mayflower has the symbolism of travel, of journey, of seeking, of trying to find a place to worship where nobody else is telling us how to do that, et cetera, et cetera, besides the colonialism and the killing off of the Native Americans. And there's two sides to that whole thing. And how can we well, we didn't say this in the group exactly, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
An interesting point to me that came up in our talk was that Mayflower emphasizes the UCC's roots in New England Puritanism and the Pilgrims and all that, which is really only a part of UCC's roots. Other parts of it came from Germany, Switzerland, and actually Native American and Pacific Islanders and Black people have all, we have roots there too. So to privilege one group, even though it's probably the majority, is maybe not the best symbol, particularly since many people these days in the actual congregation have nothing to do with New England Puritanism.
Yeah.
My problem with our name has always been the congregational part of it. And Bob brought up a good point in our group, is that for how many people is that even important anymore, given the fact that the United Church of Christ has now been in existence for such a long time, and the fact that we have many members who were never belonged to one of the four church strains that came together to make the UCC. So, yeah.
One of the history points that I have always resonated with is that the congregational churches kept congregational, whereas the ENR churches all throughout the ENR.
Yep. Yep. If you see a church like St. Mark's in Bloomington, they were an old ENR church and they became St. Mark's UCC.
A lot of those old ENR churches named themselves after saints and after different kinds of place names owing to their history. Whereas the Congregationalists, being Congregationalists from Great Britain, tended to claim their history. So
yeah,
it's a difference.
Which I just would say includes a church that merged into Mayflower Church, and which we have the stained glass windows and the, so let's remember that Mayflower is not only that congregational tradition, but so.
Well, and the Congregational Church was the Congregational Christian churches. They merged early on. And so when people were complaining about the merger with the ENRs, they had to be informed they had already done that once.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those who currently teach history, theology, and polity have a really hard time. They have to talk about the four strands we came from, but as the point Jeff was making, there's so many that it's a wide variety. So yes, Faith United Church of Christ merging into or uniting with Mayflower is one example that it was small, but great people coming out of that congregation. So we tend to, the Congregationalists were the biggest ones. And yes, they were the Congregational Christian Church, but the Christians, actually, I think they're our most interesting ancestors, but you know, they were coming from parts of New England, parts of Kentucky, parts of North Carolina. And so we don't really think about those. And there was a very strong African-American part, Black part of those churches, which we don't, know that much about. So yes, it's a very different history, but even today, the majority of people don't, in the United Church of Christ, I would dare say, they may belong to something that was in the original 4 strands, but they aren't necessarily, that isn't home for them.
There's
Anyway,
not
somebody-
It's curious going around to various churches, when you go to a church that came from an E&R tradition, it tends to, at least in my experience, it tends to still include a lot of the more pietistic approaches to worship that the E&Rs had, and still celebrate, and I want to say when Faith Church came over, we started to adopt some of those things and changed ourselves a little bit, which is kind of a harbinger of what we may be doing as we strive to become a more inclusive church.
What does the ENR stand for?
Evangelical and Reformed.
There's not very many Cradle UCC people.
And actually just this week, and it's in the United Church News, the Historical Council has now acknowledged that there's a 5th stream, and that's the Afro-Christian stream.
Christian churches.
So that will actually now, we've always, or not always, but for a long time in the UCC, we've talked about the 4 streams, and now we're invited to talk about 5 streams that formed the United Church of Christ.
When Les Pugh was here and we would sing a good Lutheran hymn, like "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" or something like that, he would say, "How many people are former Lutherans?" And all these people in the congregation would raise their hands.
Former Lutherans, former Catholics, former Quakers, former Unitarians.
We are a denomination, because of our polity, that you have to work hard to make this enterprise work. We are a covenantal church rather than a creedal church. We have to work at it. So because we are that way, we lose people as we're coming up, but we gain people that find us and like the way we do things. So we don't have very many historical Congregationalists. I think Bob and I are one of the very few people that grew up as Congregationalists.
And Christian had his hand up.
So thank you. I appreciate all these comments. One thing that I was talking about over with my group is, to me, it feels, coming from Southern boy over here, like coming from the South, it feels weird that I would imagine most of us are quick to condemn the Confederacy and Confederate symbols and stories like that, but when it comes to our Mayflower name and the symbols and images attached to all that, there's this hesitancy to see how perhaps people who are part of the Indigenous community feel when they hear that name, and when they walk into our space, see the images that we have in our temple, in our building, and back in the South, there's plenty of schools and stuff named Robert E. Lee school with just Confederate symbolism. They would feel as if one of those places where we just want to say we affirm that Black Lives Matter here, and so to me it's almost one of these things is not like the other, and so I kind of it feels really icky to me, and so just wanted to say that. I don't know if any of you want to add something to that.
It sounds like that there's a blind spot to the history in which we participate up here more directly.
How long have you been a human being?
Yeah.
Well, our group took spent some time talking about some of the historical things that have been uncovered by some of these books that Anita was talking about, and how we've had to acknowledge, Christian, exactly what you're talking about, that we're not pure like the driven snow. We've got a lot of things we have to own up to and do something about.
I just put 2 of the books in the chat. It's interesting, This Land is Their Land. He actually begins by talking about dealing with real history is very uncomfortable. And he calls the first chapter Mourning in America. Mourning as in
MOU.
grieving,
Yeah.
grieving, MOURN. So, yeah. I'm wondering some of the folks who haven't spoken yet.
I'm going to volunteer Maureen because she made some really interesting point in our discussion.
Which Maureen?
Maureen Lundy.
Okay.
Not to put her on the spot. I love you, but I put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Well, so my observation was, the first thing is that we have the commandment to love, right? And to prefer one another in love. And when somebody walks in the door as a newcomer, my thought is that you are totally welcome. We're so glad you're here. And this is how we do things. This is the music that we like. If you like it, that's great. These are the symbols that we like. And so we hope you like it. But if you don't like it, there isn't, we're not changing. And so that extravagant welcome that we want to have, I don't think it starts just at the name. I think it starts at what our environment at church is like. Did I capture it, Rudy?
Thank you.
We are very welcoming to those who are just like us.
Yes, thank you. You summed it up in one sentence there. Thank you very much.
Other groups. I don't have the group list in front of me anymore, so I can't call on people. I guess I could resurrect it.
One of the things that hit me really strongly was the fact that most of the women died. I'd never heard that. Why? What was that all about?
Childbirth, I suppose, in part.
I've never heard exactly why, but
Yeah.
I just know there weren't that many women to begin with, and they did not survive the winter.
I've
So-
definitely heard a lot of the women died. I don't know why.
But more people came, so they replenished their numbers once they got established. But anyway, other comments?
One comment that I would make that doesn't exactly relate to this, but I just think when you have that book, This Land is Their Land, I heard a person the other day on Indigenous Peoples Day talking about what is the value of these statements that we make at beginning of events. We're on the land of whatever, and they do it at the Guthrie, and sometimes we do it at church, and we do it in other places. And one of the things he said is that it's important to do that, but that's a beginning step. That's not the step. But the other thing that he said that has really stuck with me and is so profound is that it does not fundamentally understand the Native American tradition, because the notion of ownership of land is a white tradition. It's not. The Native Americans believe that they belong to the land, not that the land belongs to them. And so I think this land is their land, just symbolizing me. I don't think they thought they owned the land. The land is their Mother Earth. They belong to the land. So I just think that's, as we think about all of this, it's not only a name change, it's a whole worldview that we're carrying with us, that when we encounter Native American reality, it challenges us in a host of ways.
No, I completely agree. And the title of that book is really trying to stand against the notion of this land is our land, you know, this land is your land, this land is my land, blah, 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 blah. And I think anyway, to be fair to the book, you know, he really tries to understand it from the viewpoint of the Wampanoag peoples. So,
do we have any Native American participants at Mayflower?
We did have, but we do not currently.
Okay.
We have one here in my living room who's just raising her hand.
All right. Wonderful.
Oh, great.
I will also say my maternal grandfather was Cherokee. So that's a piece of my history. I was brought up white. I wouldn't ever try to claim anything otherwise, but the more I've dug into family history, the more I'm discovering pieces of what was there. And my ancestors escaped into the hills of Appalachia, the mountains of Appalachia, when the removal happened to Oklahoma.
Mm.
Oh, really?
So, but like I said, I wouldn't try to claim it as a.
Well, I guess I was just raising that in part out of curiosity, but obviously to hear voices from some of those different traditions, you know, Eleazar Fernandez from the Philippines is, you know, might be a valuable person to get his perspective. It's all of us, not all of us, but most of us white people here sitting and talking it's helpful, but it, you know, it is just a beginning.
Northern Europeans all, almost.
I do think there's a point though and we're getting close to the end of time. I do think that there's a point though to white people doing their own work around this. We've often wanted persons of color to do our work for us, or, you know, in the women's movement, it's been women doing the work for men. And I think that's less and less true now, and particularly at Mayflower. So I'm not impugning anybody here, but I do think it's important that white people do this work for themselves. So I think it's important to hear other voices, but we're going to have to do the hard work.
But you know, when Bud was here before, we had an Indian twins, Wilma and Wanda.
Yeah, Wilma and Wanda.
Particular Wilma Lawrence, and and Bud did a lot of work outreach to Native people, and we had an intern. I'm blanking on her name. She was just a wonderful young woman, and she died early from some disease.
Whitefeather was her last name.
Yeah, at any rate, and we did ceremonies of
Renee White Rabbit.
White Rabbit.
Okay.
Thank you. And is why we have the dream catcher up on this in the sanctuary is because of Wilma's influence.
Interesting.
I just wanted to make a point. I take Maureen's point that we are not as inclusive as we claim to be sometimes, that we need to be open to incorporating new ideas that come with new people. At the same time, we have a history. I think it's very important to remain connected to our history, our roots. And that's why I'm interested in biblical literacy, because that's our roots too. But we're rooted in it partly in that awful history of the Puritans coming and participating in massacring the Native Americans. We can't just get rid of that by changing our name. We have to recognize that we come with good and bad elements that we've brought in the history. Our responsibility is to take what we have and make something better out of it, incorporating new ideas and people as we go along, but not to lose sight of our history. Whatever form, I'm not saying we have to keep the name Mayflower, but we have to stay connected to history somehow. That's an important value for me.
And it would seem to me that confession might be a part of all this. And I'm struck there is no prayer of confession in the worship. And that's, I understand there's different schools of thought about that, but certainly confession regarding our sharing of that history, not just a one time, but just to have that as part of our ongoing attitude might be helpful.
It is 8 o'clock, so I'm going to draw us to a close. I want to thank you all for coming and particularly putting up with all the technology issues that we had. And as I said at the beginning, this is the opening of a conversation. It is not anywhere near ready for us to, take votes and that kind of thing. And I think I would just really appreciate people's honesty and their willingness to participate. So with that, I'm going to.
And thank you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Anita.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your graciousness with a few of my little mistakes here and there, but anyway. So we will see you all. Christian, was there anything you wanted to say as we close this out?
Thank you so much for your teaching, Anita. Appreciate your time, your energy, and thank you to all who came. I think I want to invite folks. I'm going to stay on for maybe about 10 minutes or so, like post conversation. If anybody wants to sit and chat about this stuff, be happy to sit around and talk some more. This is like a sermon talk back time. So yeah, if anybody wants to stay on and just chit chat.
Okay, I'll make you the host because I'm going to go eat dinner.
I need to go eat dinner and come back.
Live long and prosper.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Thanks,
Good night.
everybody. Bye-bye.
There he is.
Let's see who bites. There's nobody.
Anita, we got to talk about Guilford sometime.
We can.
Good.
I'm the host now. So
okay.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
I have a question. How can we not be such a white church? How can we welcome, integrate, we're always talking about welcoming and stuff, but we're such a white church. I love the Native American tradition. My mom lived on a reservation during her high school years and had many Native friends. And my dad's family lived in this, has been in Minnesota since the early 1800s and had interaction with Native people. How can we, is there a way we can encourage that or increase that?
Yeah, I think this is a really powerful question. This is also the question that like every white church, well, that's not true. That's the question that a lot of white churches right now are asking. I think one thing, like, I think we sometimes like reach in history to try to bring about the future, and I think that's what we were talking about now in this class is like the history of things. One thing that really, really surprised me that I heard once, and it was Stephanie Lafayette who told me, she's kind of a bit of a Mayflower Church whiz, history whiz, if you ever get a chance to talk to her. don't tell her I sent you because I just sure. But one thing that she had said is that like the people who planted Mayflower Church, at the time that it was started in 1925, the borders of Minneapolis and Richfield were different. And so the people who started Mayflower Church deliberately planted it like on the other side, like not in Minneapolis, because it was too urban, quote unquote. And so like, I don't know, it just kind of echoes like racist language, like it's too urban, like, well, what does that mean, And so I think there's some history there. And I also think like kind of what Maureen Lundy, what you were saying earlier about like, all are welcome, however, and I think like part of it is like just, and not saying this is a bad thing at all, but just like the way that we do church is a really white way. So, and what I mean by that is like, I remember I had a friend in seminary who said, I can't think of my religion apart from my Blackness. Like, and so when you think about that, it's like, when you live in a society that's where whiteness is the norm, that Sunday morning for some folks is the only time in the entire week that you are around people who understand you and who see you in this particular regard. And so it's a really hard thing. And so I don't know, I guess I want to do one thing here is to like, I don't necessarily, how do I say this without sounding like, I don't necessarily, so we're super white, yes. And also I think like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what I think starts to be troublesome to me, what starts to be troublesome to me, and we're talking extending like the conversation from this class, is like when we hold on to, and like it seems like sometimes celebrate histories and narratives that have functioned to oppress people, and specifically I'm talking about Mayflower Church here, and some of the imagery in our sanctuary, our name, it starts to feel weird when there is a clinging to those things.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Totally.
And so it's like, I don't, Bud Friend Jones, after today, he said, Christian, your sermon on Sunday, if you were to preach that in a Black church, people would have been standing up and, clapping and doing that. And I'm like, cool, thank you for that, and also like, I don't expect, and I'm not disappointed at the Minnesota really white way of being like, yeah, right on, Christian, let me clap and great job, boom, see you at the door. Like, I am not me. Well, me, this is just me. I'm one voice out of many in our community. I am not asking for our church to become less white. It's not something that I'm like, oh, we really have to get more folks of color in here. I think like my dream. So here's my dream. My ideal, the dream for me is that we create a space where folks, we create a space regardless of who they are, we don't have to defend ourselves. And one thing that we do have to defend ourselves, and this is from my perspective, one thing that we do have to defend ourselves for right now is our name. When I meet people out in the wild who may or may not be Christians, who may or may not care about religion or whatever, they always say, why is your church called Mayflower Church? Like every time, and that's what I mean by defend that, Anyway, so that's kind of my long-winded answer there. But it is, yeah, I mean, it's something that I think, it's a hard conversation to have. And I also like, I think, I don't know, I'm kind of the thought that like, as that movie says, like, if we build it, they will come, so. That's it.
I think about our people who are at our church now are comfortable there. And I don't want to take away the comfort. I just want to extend it.
Mm-hmm.
That
Right.
it can, that we can include people who want to sing, Martin Luther hymns, and it can include people that want to sing something else. I don't know if we can include people who don't want to sing, but that's another issue.
They can listen.
But you know what I mean. Yeah.
Right. Right. I don't know, just out of curiosity, how are some of you feeling after the class, particularly in regard to like what we call ourselves as a church?
During, can you hear me?
Yeah. We can hear you loud and clear.
During conversation in our group, I had to fess up that I am Canadian, and I have a totally different, I had a totally different perspective on this Mayflower issue, because it isn't part of my my history, as it were, even though some of the people did come across from England. But and the same rings true for the history that Americans have gone through, that are just starting to talk about and realize that they need ownership before things can start to correct themselves. So my history, from the point of view of Mayflower, it meant nothing to me. It was just in a name when I came to Mayflower, and the Sellers were sponsors of Judy and I when we came, and I've been here for 16 years, and I know when people say Mayflower, for the majority of people that live in sort of this southern part of Minneapolis, it's a point, it's a location point more than anything else. Canadian Thanksgiving is totally different. It's celebrated in October, and it's the first Monday of the second Monday of the month of October, and it has nothing to do with Mayflower, Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock. It is a celebration for a successful harvest, and it's celebrated with feasts.
Lovely.
So, as I say, Mayflower meant nothing to me. And this is why this discussion tonight, and a book that I did read while I was doing some volunteer work at the church, Nathaniel Philbrook wrote a book called Mayflower. And when I started to read that, I started to realize that there were myths and realities, like Nita was mentioning. So this has been a very, very helpful and a very informative evening for me. It shed a lot of light on things for me, and I'm not going to apologize for being Canadian, and but I am not, how shall I say this? I am not well schooled in American history and the icons that go along with it.
Not if you grew up in America, you probably aren't well schooled in the icons that go with American history either. So
Yeah,
I can
really?
assume so.
I think you're probably saved the biases. I mean, I wish I was in Canada.
Yeah.
You wish what?
I grew up in Canada.
Ooh, yeah.
My grandparents lived a mile south of the Canadian border.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have.
Yeah. Well, this is why I enjoy living here, I must say, because I'm known here, because a lot of people have relatives in Canada, and there's a lot of sort of certain in generational history, there's movement. So, and there's seasons here. So
That's true.
I came from California, so I'm not, I miss my seasons. So,
Yeah, this is the place to be. Yo, I'm gonna get going, y'all.
okay.
I chit chat for a little bit. Thank y'all so much for joining this class and for joining me for a little post chat.
Thanks, Coach.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Really soon.
Nice, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.